Hi, this is Rick for EDU Mobile, and today we're going to talk about applications in Android. As a kind of a high-level overview, let's first talk about the Android operating system in general. This is really a multi-user Unix system where each user is a representation of each app. So every app runs as its own user for security reasons, and it is assigned a unique user ID by the system. So every app has its own user ID by default and its own user. So every process in an app and every app runs in its own virtual machine. An app's code, therefore, is isolated from all other apps. Now, there is a way to set the user ID of an app such as it shares users or it shares a user ID with another app. But we'll get to that later. But this principle of apps having a unique user ID where only an app can access its own, its exclusive data, is called by Android the principle of least privilege. In other words, every app has access only to the components it requires to function and no others by default. Okay. So what are these components we're speaking of? Well, apps are made up of multiple components or pieces, each of which could potentially become an entry point for an app. So rather than having a monolithic app, let's say, that starts at a certain point and ends at another point, an Android application is really made up of multiple parts, and each part could belong to this app or even another app, and apps can use components from other applications. But each part of an application can potentially become an entry point for a user to interact with that application. So the idea of an application in a traditional sense doesn't really exist in Android. An Android application is really kind of a loose a conglomeration of interchangeable components, each of which could become an entry point for the application. Activities are one such component, and they make up the user interface of an app. We can think of each activity as being a single screen of user interaction. So as our high-level overview progresses, I'm just going to mention what these components are. An activity is the first type of component, a user interface. Services, on the other hand, run in the background. They do not have a user interface, and they will do things like perform long-running tasks or access things remotely, like items on the internet and so forth. Services do not have a user interface, but they are top-level components in an app. Content providers are a little bit different. Content providers manage persistent data for the app. So anything that is of a persistent nature that would be stored in the file system or maybe in a database or even online is accessed through a content provider. Now we can define content providers, but we can also use something called a content resolver within our app to get and access data from another content provider if that content provider has granted permissions for our app to do so. The Android system has several predefined content providers like the contacts database and things like that that we can access from within our application. The fourth kind of component that we deal with is called a broadcast receiver. Broadcast receivers exist to respond to system-wide messages, and these are called broadcast messages. The system will initiate many of these, low battery, for example. But apps can also send broadcasts for other apps to receive. So we have activities, user interfaces, services, background tasks, content providers, data access, and broadcast receivers. In other words, things that respond to system-wide events. What glues all of this together is called intents. An intent is an object, and intents kind of bind all these loose components together. An intent is really just a message. It is an intent for something to happen. So an activity can call an intent that starts a service, or an activity can call an intent that starts another activity or a broadcast receiver. Content providers are handled a little bit differently, but activities, services, and broadcast receivers are all activated by intents. We can actually also use a broadcast intent to activate a broadcast receiver, for instance. So for activities and services, the intent contains a lot of information, potentially. It contains what activity or service we're going to activate it, how to activate it, and it can also pass data either within itself as properties of the intent, or it can pass data sourced from a URI. But for broadcast receivers, all we're really sending in a broadcast intent is the message for the broadcast. Some message we want to send to all other activities in all other apps that are registered to receive messages from our app. Or the system will initiate broadcast intents that broadcasters receivers in our app can respond to. Now, content resolvers, I already said content providers are accessed in a different way. Content providers are not activated by intents. We set up a content resolver to get content from a content provider. So a content resolver gets a connection with the content provider and accesses its data. If it's allowed to by the content provider, it can modify the data as well. All transactions, though, for data are managed by the resolver. In other words, we don't directly tell the content provider what to give us. We tell the resolver what we want, and then the content provider responds to a message that the resolver sends to it. So to kind of review that, content resolvers are the messaging piece for content providers, whereas intents are the messaging piece, the interactive messaging between activities, services, and broadcast receivers. We have something called a manifest file. Every Android app contains an Android manifest.xml file. This is a file where a lot of things are going to be declared. First of all, we have to declare every component within our app. All of the providers, all of the services, the receivers, the activities, all of those have to be declared within the app. Every permission that is required by the app, things like the app needs to access the internet, the app needs to access the content list, all of those permissions need to also be listed in the manifest file. And these will be in our app where the user will have to grant permission to the application to do these things. So we'll get a little pop-up, a toast or something that says, this app wants to access the internet. Is that okay? And then the user will have to grant permission to do that. We also declare the minimum API level required by the application. We have to list the hardware and software features of the device that are required by the app. In other words, the app wants to use the camera or Bluetooth or some other piece that is used by the app. Location services is an example of this. And then any external libraries that the app has to be linked with will need to be declared in the Android manifest file as well. So the Android manifest file is a sort of one-stop shop that tells you all the capabilities, all the components, everything that needs to be done, all the permissions and device settings and everything like that that will need to be done before this app can run. And there are some other things declared in the manifest file as well. Finally, there are resources included in every app. These are things like images and values and strings and things like that that are not embedded directly in the code, but are accessed by the code so the app can function. This also includes our layout XMLs for our user interfaces, I should say. Now, an app can draw on more than one set of resources. Images at different resolutions, let's say, for various devices. Strings can be localized to different languages. And so for this reason, we don't tend to embed these resources in our code. we put them in XML files, in resource XML files that are accessed by the code. So for example, string values for controls should be listed in strings XML. This makes it very simple to localize our strings for various languages. Thank you very much.